of image of God, Imago Dei. We threw away Imago Dei in our slavery to make people less than human. And if you think that's an old idea, out on the street in Ferguson one night with a 16-year-old kid during the protests, he said to me, I still feel like I'm treated like 3/5 of a person, which is what the U.S. wrote in the Constitution, that blacks were 3/5 of a person. So this notion of how slavery continues, the original sin lingers on because it's the dehumanizing of the other. The other is not really made in the image of God. That's what makes us all one. We are all made in the image of God. And for me, from a faith point of view, that's foundational to overcoming the otherness. But our continuing original sin goes on, and it was fanned, the fears were fanned by this election. And now we're going to see what happens in the governance from the campaigning. And so the faith community is wanting to protect vulnerable people because that's what always changes us and reminds us of, in fact, how we're made. Now it is time to open it up. Do we have microphones or? We do. Okay. I see a microphone right next to an open hand. Then I want to come up to Tim Dixon here in front in a few moments. But go ahead.
Ich werde auf Deutsch sprechen.
I'll ask my question in German. My name is Alec Gagna, and I welcome what Mr. Swing has said, that we need to embrace diversity. The greatest diversity that is being destroyed is the fact that we are losing so many types of plant and animal. Warren Buffett said that there is a war of the rich against the poor. We, the rich, are winning this war. If you like, this is a kind of racism that is taking place at the moment, the racism of rich against poor. I also think there's a racism against compassion. If people die in France or Germany from bomb attacks, then Google suddenly changes its homepage to the flags of Germany or France. If that happens in Libya or in Iraq, that doesn't happen. Our monuments don't have or don't pay tribute to people lost in illegal wars. We need to underline that immigration can take place voluntarily. Many people are coming from war zones, and those who sell weapons sow the seeds of refugees. Now, some people might say this is good business. And the weapon business is one which increases GDP. Everybody seems to be worried about GDP, but I don't believe that it's genuinely linked to quality of life. And finally, I think that we should stand together. If we are diverse in our religion, in the color of our skin, then we can recognize that, but we should not be divided by it. The most important thing is to say no to the export of weapons and closing NATO bases throughout the whole world. Thank you.
Could you bring the microphone up here? I want Tim Dixon, who's done research on immigration in Europe, fascinating things, right here in front, to share a bit of that briefly. And then I want you to ask questions of panelists about what we are seeing and how to change it, very specifically. So, Tim.
Thanks. I'll jump right in here. So I'm very interested in thoughts from the panel just on, I mean, I think we've been doing quite a lot of research. We've got reports coming out, Germany and France, that are really digging into what's driving the appeal of populism. And I do think that from what's unusual about this moment is the political dynamics are really similar across the West, and it's quite remarkable. And it's the issue of otherness that's working everywhere. I think what the research points to for us is that we're in something of a race against time, not just a race against racism. It's not because whole countries are embracing racism, but it's because, you know, maybe a quarter of the population responds directly to the populist xenophobic appeal. There's another group, 25, 35%, pretty consistently across different countries, who've got more cosmopolitan values. They're highly educated, city-dwelling, more affluent. They're us, right? And then there's a group in the middle, 40 to 50%, who have a set of anxieties about, I think fundamentally, I mean, it's economic insecurity and so forth, but it's a loss of belonging and a loss of identity. And the populists are coming along and saying, here's the answer. Define us and them. The threat is them. We have to define ourselves. We can make ourselves great again. America, Germany, France, whatever. We make ourselves great again by drawing these lines. The challenge, I think, for us is that the conversation that we have as the mostly belonging to the sort of cosmopolitan, liberal, you know, citizens of the world identity, we don't actually relate to the more localised identity. Our way of seeing the world doesn't work for that group in the middle, the anxious middle, the 40 or 50%. They're being persuaded that the problems that they're seeing around them, the loss of identity, is actually to do with immigration. And it's a threat to culture and to security and to their economy. So I think the question for us is, how do we reach the middle, which is a different question for us than how do we persuade ourselves. And so much of the way that we're talking about the issue, you know, makes more sense, doesn't really reach much beyond that 25, 35% of the population. So I think the pragmatic question for us to ask is, you know, where do we learn from each other about how we shift the dynamics of rising racism and the rising appeal of racism, not just at the individual level, but across whole countries? What lessons can we draw from past history where that rising tide of racism, which, you know, is a fundamental threat to democracy, where do we learn the lessons? And I think one key insight that we get from our research is that it's not the appeal of the message of diversity is great and difference is great, which actually terrifies an awful lot of people in the middle who aren't racist, but they're just scared of change. But a message more around inclusive patriotism that says, you know, this is what being French is. It's being an inclusive society. This is what being American is. It's being an inclusive. It's being a melting pot. And building those narratives that are local but are also inclusive. Mm-hmm. I'd be interested in thoughts on that, because I think that's what the research across different countries, that seems to be the most powerful message, that has a sense of belonging and identity and answers the need that people have and their sense of dislocation, but does it in a way that includes the other and doesn't define identity as being all about exclusion. And I think that then says we need faith groups, we need sports, we need mainstream culture. You know, and politicians aren't the ones who make that happen, right? It's a bigger fight around culture.
Thoughts on that, quickly. Thoughts on that? Yeah, quick. Jump in. Go ahead, please.
Okay. I think that's very useful and it's very important. Just in terms of what might work, perhaps in terms of lessons, is looking at how the LGBTI community has managed to mainstream itself across most of the Western world in a matter of years. I mean, it's in a matter of in the last 20 years in very many ways, where 10 years ago, if you talked about gay marriage as an issue, almost everybody in the West would say we don't want it. It's not a good thing. But there's been cultural change, I think, on that aspect where people say it's fine. I think there's a lot to, and from my perspective, I think one of the most important changes has been in Latin America, which is a vastly Catholic community. In 1999, at the UN, the leaders of the homophobe community were Latin countries, Islamic countries, African countries, Asian countries. Today, the leaders of the openness debate at the UN level of human rights is Uruguay, it's Argentina, it's these countries from Latin America. How that change happened, I still don't understand, but I think it did happen over 15 years, that there's been a real transformational change. The US, the same thing. If you look at how the voting at the polls around gay marriage, just 5 years ago, it was way 60% against gay marriage. Today, I think polls are saying it's 60%, supporting gay marriage. That's a huge culture shift, I think.
So I'm hearing from the research in that it's supporting cultural change, not just political change. Yeah. Abduli.
Yep. So I think the work that you're doing is fantastic from a research perspective, but I also think it's important also to look at the work of practitioners. The organization that I'm involved with, we do a lot of work in the space of combating hate speech and combating extremism. And in that space, we do work with a lot of former right-wing extremists and a lot of former neo-Nazis. And it's important to look at their narratives. Their experiences are often highly demonized as well. And the same common thread comes through when you ask, why did you choose this life? Why did you resort to a life of this form? And the common answer is, I didn't have an alternative. I was never given an alternative. So if you look at the past year and a bit, and looking at the rise of populism, it comes down to four main categories. It's A, the major terrorist attacks, it's a migration crisis, it's a disillusionment with the establishment, and it's a stagnant economic system. And unless you're able to communicate the why and provide an alternative to those communities, you have to realize that you are actually fighting for those basically pools of people with populist candidates, with violent extremist organizations, and unless you can communicate in a way that's savvy and makes meaning to them, you're going to just see more and more of this.
We're just talking to ourselves over and over again. Questions? We have a microphone. Where's the mic? Okay.
Ms. Filali, at the beginning of the discussion, talked about or touched upon the idea of building bridges between minorities and people that have different backgrounds and different stories. And I was wondering which are the steps that you think are necessary in order to actually build those
How do you
bridges?
build bridges? Good. I love short, succinct questions, not sermons and commentaries. How do you build bridges?
Short
Please.
answers too.
Yes, I love short answers too.
Okay, so you were right saying that it is very difficult to go to the other because we feel so secure in our own community. And we don't have to be naive. To go to the other is a very important human being movement. It's kind of a journey. And I really do think that you have to be supported to do that movement. If you're not prepared, it's impossible. So we have been building a wide range of intercultural activities, having festivals where you can have people meeting through music, through sports. If you have people building a project together, then they will see the future in the same way, and they can make a movement in the same time.
Exactly. I see a hand right back there. Yes, right there, and then back up here. Please.
Good morning, esteemed panelists. I have been really kind of anxious to get to the mic, not to be heard, but to start something here. My name is Gail Davis. I'm Listen Give Initiative, and I'm in the United Nations external partner around the Sustainable Development Goals. It starts with each one of us in the home. It starts with how we train our children. But I'm going to leave off with this. President Obama said in his speech recently, when Irish first came to the United States, they were seen as an issue. When the Italians came to the United States, they were seen as an issue. When the Chinese came to the U.S., and thereon, they were seen as an issue. But quickly, they became part of the infrastructure that together built the United States, that all of us together built countries. We must look inside of ourselves, because at the end of the day, if you prick us, we all bleed red. And I think if we can come from that place of celebrating one another and celebrating culture, okay, and the belief structure of each person, and get down to the very basic human form and needs, that's where we begin. The research is great, and all of that is great, but practicality and applying this practicality of just basic human to human needs. We all put our pants on the same, and we go to sleep the same at night. Thank you.
So the audience of our children who watch what we say and what we do may be our most important audience. Yeah. Right here, then back here. Too close here.
My name is Olav Fixer-Tveit. I'm the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches.